The annelids, which are relatively closely related to the mollusks, are the first organisms that we've seen so far that have this modification of the body form. That is, they are segmented. There are lots of worm-like animals, animals that are long and thin. It used to be that basically any animal that's long and thin was referred to as a worm. But the true worms, or segmented worms, have their bodies divided up into these segments, each of which has the same repeated structure. This, for example, some of these you're familiar with. You're familiar with, say, earthworms. But a lot of these animals are animals that you've probably never seen before. This, for example, is a marine polychaete. You're probably more familiar with this earthworm, a nightcrawler. Again, you can see all the different segments on its body. Um, the body form of one of these worms is fairly standard. There's a head end, which is slightly different than all the segments following it. There's an end that carries an anus, and that's different from the other segments. But in between, all of the segments are pretty much the same. This is what's called homonymous segmentation, where you have the repetition of essentially the same segment over and over again. Internally, no matter which segment you look at in, say, an earthworm, you're going to see pretty much the same stuff. A while ago, a long time ago, I discussed the coelom, which is like your peritoneal cavity. It's a cavity that wraps around the digestive system in an animal. But we haven't had much reason to talk about the coelom until now. What's shown in blue here is the coelom of an earthworm. And the coelom of an earthworm basically consists of this tube that's wrapped around the digestive system, but segmented in that there is this sheet of tissue called a septum, separating the coelomic cavity in one segment from the coelomic cavity in the next segment. This allows earthworms to use that coelomic fluid, the fluid within that cavity, as a hydrostatic skeleton. And let me explain sort of what that means. Because there's this incompressible fluid, there's a bag of incompressible fluid within each segment of an earthworm. When you have muscles that are wrapped around the circumference of the worm and they contract, they make that segment thinner. And because the fluid is incompressible, that segment then has to become longer. Because each segment is independent of all the others in an animal like, say, an earthworm, this means that the length and width of each segment can be manipulated independently. This is how an earthworm crawls. So the first thing that it does is that it allows the rear segments to fatten up. And you can see these little hairs or hooks. They're called setae. They're basically invisible on an earthworm, although you can feel them if you run your hand backward along an earthworm's body. But those dig into the soil around the earthworm. This is a burrowing animal usually. They dig into the soil and hold it in place. Then circular muscles, again, the ones around the circumference of the segments, contract up at the front of the animal, and that pushes the front end forward. Once the front end has been pushed forward into the soil, the longitudinal muscles, the ones that run from front to back within each segment, shorten, and that fattens up those front segments. They now serve as an anchor because they're thicker than the hole that the front end of the body just made in the soil. So that fattens up, and then this wave of movement travels down from head to tail along the organism. As the longitudinal muscles contract, it brings all those rear segments forward. Once they've come to the front, the worm can just repeat that whole cycle again, and at every stage it sort of pushes itself slightly forward through the soil. This might not seem all that impressive or interesting, but the ability to burrow in this way is not a trivial thing. It allowed the annelids to take up a lot of novel ways of making a living that involve being buried. For example, earthworms live by eating soil. As they burrow through the soil, they pass it into their digestive systems. Their digestive systems absorb and take out everything that can be digested, and then they just pass out their own poop along with anything like the indigestible minerals out the back end. They are extremely important in the ecology of soil, and they can live in tremendous density. So they're very successful living in this particular burrowing lifestyle. As I mentioned before, within each segment, you see the same set of organs repeated over and over. The circulatory system, just as in the mollusks, can be pretty sophisticated. When some organisms, some annelids like earthworms, the circulatory system is closed. If you look at the dorsal side of an earthworm, if you can get it to hold still, you'll see this pulsing red vessel that is pushing circulatory fluid that contains oxygen-carrying pigments along the length of the animal. Gas exchange can occur through certain dedicated structures, like sort of these leafy structures called parapodia that are sticking off the sides of the animal. Some annelids have gills, and some of them simply breathe through the body's surface, along with a relatively sophisticated circulatory system. Earthworms and other annelids have a relatively sophisticated digestive system. As I mentioned before, when you have a one-way or complete gut, you can have different parts of the digestive system specialized to do different things. So for example, if you dissect open an earthworm, you can see a structure called the crop that's used to store undigested food. The gizzard is used to grind food in small particles, and then the food absorption actually occurs in the long intestine. In the earthworm, there are actually two different circulatory systems, which allows it to attain relatively large size, at least compared to something like, say, most flatworms. But these organisms, like any organism that is going to respire through its skin, is typically restricted to being somewhere moist. They cannot truly get very far away from moist habitats.